there's a lot of things that we're going to just rise up the stack with and leverage abstractions. We could lament the loss of those things, but what's going to be ahead of us in terms of what's possible is really exciting. We know what we're going to lose, and we're fundamentally loss aversion machines, but like we don't know how great it's going to be.
Hello, folks, and welcome to HangarDX podcast. This is a podcast about developer experience and how engineering teams solve productivity challenges at scale. Obviously, we talk a lot about AI as well. I'm your host, Ankit, co-founder of Aviator. At Aviator, we are building AI coding verification platform that creates guardrails for reducing AI slop. And today with us, we have my guest, Steve. Steve is known for value stream mapping, and he's like the value stream mapping guy, as well as he is author of Flow Engineering and is a leading voice in how organizations should structure themselves for speed and value. And this is probably the best time to talk to Steve, as we are in sort of like this turmoil of how AI is changing everything. So, Steve, welcome. Really excited to have you here. Can you please introduce yourself for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, it's so great to be here and having this conversation right now. It's such an exciting time. I've been in tech for a very, very long time, starting actually in tech support and working through like IT management, build and release engineering, CTO, advisor, consultant, like mercenary consultant, strategic management consultant. Now, I focus on helping companies get more things done or get out of their own way, essentially. And the thread throughout my whole career is that I've always had this really high sensitivity to like friction and how hard it is to do everything. So it's a very exciting time considering that. But it never goes away. It's always a topic that I think we all really struggle with.
Amazing. All right. So, given that this is going to be a short session, let's dive straight into the topics. For the unstarted, maybe you can start with giving a quick introduction of what value stream mapping means. And maybe if you can give an example to explain.
Yeah. So, I mean, the classic sense and where it comes from is manufacturing. The origin of this is kind of a field of study in management science called time and motion studies, which was essentially like, let's watch work happening and measure it so that we can find out where things are getting stuck or slowed down. Because we know, I mean, as individual contributors and even as leaders, it's very difficult to understand where to focus to improve performance in terms of throughput, getting more things done, unless we have a view of the system of work and we have like some quantifiable data, even qualifiable data, right? Like, because everyone doing the work has a different opinion. They're like, well, the person upstream of me sends me garbage and the person downstream of me doesn't work fast enough. So why do I need to speed up, right? So, and that opinion is just everybody in the system, right? Essentially. So like value stream mapping really allows us to visualize a flow of work and then quantify it in some way. So measure how long it takes to do each activity and then how much time passes between those activities. But really the most important thing about it is that it connects end to end from like idea to delivery of value, right? Like all the way to the customers is the most classic sense. But that's manufacturing is the origin story. The modern context is like, we don't have assembly lines in knowledge work and digital work, right? We can't follow the bits. You can try to follow the task all the way through, but really consequential value streams like product development, for instance, or R&D, these take lots of time. There's many contributors. There's lots of handoffs. Sometimes work is flowing through multiple different systems of management. And so it's very difficult to actually track it. It takes a long time to collect the data if your data has any kind of quality to it, which it often doesn't. So you can collect a bunch of data and it can tell you nothing, that it'll tell you that you need to clean up your data, right? But so I think that this in knowledge work is very valuable because we can't just trace, a JIRA ticket, just watch a JIRA ticket and understand where a bottleneck is. You can collect a bunch of data, but it's really challenging to do that well. And what I like about value stream mapping is not that it gives us empirical data, It's that it brings together everyone who's involved in creating and delivering value so that we can have a conversation about how that's going. And I think that's the most important part about it. You could throw away the map, but the mapping process is really valuable.
Very interesting. Can you maybe give a quick example of how this looks like in practice?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, it's really challenging. It's multiple days, people in a room putting post-it notes on a wall, and everybody's kind of exhausted at the end of it, and it doesn't necessarily translate into like action and things actually changing. So the origin of flow engineering was like, how do I make this really lightweight and appealing? Because there's two things that I always think about: that nobody cares and nobody has time. And so we kind of like attack those two problems. We make it very, very simple and then tie it directly to value and action, so that what we do is pick a target. What do you want to do? You want to double throughput? Do you want to cut lead time in half so you learn faster, or you have faster feedback, or you want to improve quality? And then we kind of map out what happens today. So step by step, we actually work backwards from like, you deliver whatever you deliver. How does that happen? What happens before that? What happens before that? Then we add the measurement, and all of a sudden you can see, okay, well, there's tons of time spent here, where everybody is talking about this area as a hotspot. And then we basically iterate on that understanding to create a future state design of like, what would better look like. So for digital product development, what it usually looks like is we map out a value stream of the SDLC all the way from hopefully like a strategic objective, but it's often like somebody gives you some requirements, right? And then all the way to deployed into production and ideally turned on, right, for customers, like actually released. And you have common bottlenecks, right? It's like takes a long time in planning, takes a long time in testing. You often have a lot of environmental challenges. Code reviews take a long time. What's really interesting is when we dig into those things. So if there's a hotspot in any of those areas, we can dig down and understand like, why is that taking so long, right? Which is usually what the step that we miss when we don't do this type of mapping, right? Everybody has all the complaints kind of accumulate, but we don't stop to ask the question like, why is this happening, and how do we address the causes of those problems?
Very interesting. So, this is a good segue to kind of actually go into the core topic, which I want to talk about today, which is impact of AI in value stream flow, as well as like organizational structure itself. So maybe just starting with, given that you actually do this practice with a few organizations, have you seen sort of like some patterns changing in the last year or so in terms of like how AI is impacting some of this value stream?
I mean, early on, we had this challenge where there was all this activity around development. Like you could write code faster, and that got really exciting until you realize that, oh, we have to review all that code, and it's not going anywhere because it's low quality, and we don't have enough people to test it, and all the downstream requirements were not in place. I think we've seen more of an investment in supporting capabilities, right? Platforms, guidelines, templates, standards, specs, spec-driven development, these things that kind of make that development practice more robust, more consistent, more reliable, higher quality, reduce the review burden, reduce the testing burden, and create more confidence in that production. Because one of the things you'll hear a lot, and you also hear it challenged a lot, is this idea that coding was never the bottleneck, right? Writing lines of code was never the bottleneck. I agree with that. I think we have a lot of challenges elsewhere, but that's not to say that writing code doesn't help us get to better performance, right? There's a big difference between writing the code for a feature and writing code for all that supporting infrastructure that makes it possible to write that feature faster, more reliably, more consistently, at higher confidence, right? And I think the most successful organizations have been looking at this capability and saying, okay, how can we make this accelerate all these other bottlenecks that we've had? Challenges with reviews, challenges with CI/CD pipelines, challenges with environmental availability, scheduling, scaling, operation, maintenance. How do we use this to do more testing, right? Do testing at higher levels of confidence, testing in different ways, doing testing earlier, right? So I think that the most successful organizations are really investing even more in the capabilities that they'd already significantly invested in, right? One of the things that was really fascinating to me a couple weeks ago, I watched a video from Google from 2015, and they had this graph of commits, and they had like human commits, and then they had commits by automation. And the commits by automation in 2015 at Google were 2-to-1. That kind of culture where they've just been investing in developer support for so long is why we see like a new Google product every week now, and all these interconnected capabilities and the ability to really like release production ready features that don't bring down the rest of their ecosystem, right? There's a lot of risk in it in a code base that large and complicated. But by all indications, they're full steam ahead.
Right. So this is also interesting aspect, right? Because with AI, obviously every person and every developer is seeing higher speeds. At the same time, as you mentioned, right, a lot of infrastructure is needed, like code reviews, better CI systems, better validation. How should an organization think about, like, even going back to the value stream topic, has that path changed? Is there anything they should be doing differently as engineering leaders, for instance, or even sort of like business leaders who are supporting the engineering organizations, the product organizations? How are they supposed to react to it? Are there things that they should be doing differently? Or obviously the bottlenecks are also slightly changing, right? Like we're moving
Mm-hmm.
away from coding sprints being long to kind of like, okay, now the validation, verification, planning phases are longer. How are kind of like teams adapting to it?
Yeah, I think that this is really interesting, and I think it's going to vary in a lot of organizations. But like, a couple things are surprisingly still true. Like the principles behind flow and the idea that you have to build something before you can test it 100% is still true. You have to build something before you can release it. You have to uh, have an idea before you can produce an output. So like order of operations hasn't necessarily fundamentally changed. But that being said, the ability to kind of quickly validate things like shift, there's so much that we can now shift left, where when I have an initial idea, I could carry that through logically very, very quickly, right? Before I physically, well, it's like digitally build it, I can in many cases like simulate it to a large degree, right? If I have an AI agent with sufficient context, then I almost have a digital twin of whatever its context window can contain, right? I mean, it's got my whole code base. It might actually have enough context to understand an ecosystem view of my technology. It might understand my customer personas. It might understand my roadmap and my strategy so that I can actually effectively and people talk about this all the time, that on their ride into work, and I don't advocate for working before you work, but this idea that you could just conversationally explore a lot of these things, that is testing, right? Like that is the ability to kind of validate things as early as possible, catch risks, catch outliers, understand what you know and what you don't know. All these things that are expensive to discover later can shift, and that can be largely operationalized, right? I mean, we can build skills that actually make sure that before we move on, we have to check these boxes, right? We have to understand what is the risk to existing feature sets? What is the risk of creating technical debt? All these things can be shifted around now. So I think that's very exciting. It's very interesting. The other thing that I want to highlight is that we now have the ability to very cheaply scenario plan things or explore multiple parallel paths very cheaply, right? So you can imagine, really fantastic companies today do A/B testing in production, right? They're running multiple variants. We could do that much earlier and to a much greater extent, where we're A/B testing from the very beginning. let's run 3 scenarios through and have them, compete for, which one is the most robust, which one is the most potentially engaging. Like there's a whole bunch of capabilities and possibilities that are now potentially very affordable, right, under the circumstances.
Nice. So this is also a good segue into talking about how software development is changing, and also more specifically some aspects we even cared about 2 years ago, like context switching and flow state. It feels like, given the intensity that has increased from AI, that those things have completely gone out of the window. So let's kind of like talk a little bit about, what does that mean? Is context switching today is just, a concept that was, an era of 2024 and nobody cares about it anymore? Are flow states something that are non-existent? And both of these things are related. I know we also talked briefly about multitasking. So where does that leave software engineering?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to think about. I think that it's hard to say how much there's a pendulum swing or just kind of a march of progression that we're seeing right now under the circumstances of rapid change, right? It seems like rapid change is actually just like escalating, not kind of like swinging back and forth, right? But under circumstances of rapid change, you kind of expect to follow different patterns depending on, I think, depending on your strategy. Like it's still incredibly valuable to just focus and go extremely deep on something, provided you have clarity of vision and a commitment to owning a very specific thing. If your goal is to be the best in the world at X, and X is narrow enough that you can own it, then this idea of switching to different contexts or exploration, it's a tax. It's a tax on your focus. I think that, if we zero that down from like a company perspective to an individual contributor or a leader, the same thing applies, right? If you have very specific goals, if you have very specific metrics that you aim to move, and context switching is likely a tax, right? Unless what you're doing is intentionally testing various scenarios, right? And all of those things connect back to your goal. So as engineers, as leaders, there is value in intentionally exploring and saying, I'm going to run a different experiment every week. But there's a very real risk of just doing 20 random things that don't actually, help you make progress or ultimately get shipped, right? And so I think that like this idea of context switching is interesting in that sense, potentially valuable if your intentional goal is exploration and switching contexts because those contexts have distinct value. Otherwise, it's a very real risk, right? Each of those threads has to be maintained the same way that, you open a branch, it starts to get stale. If you don't merge it back, then,
Right.
You're going to have problems. I think that also context switching, it should be measured the same way that we measure it for machines. There's a cost to throwing away the context, loading in a new context, right? And our ability to actually load in context is actually increased dramatically, right? I can very quickly switch to a new task and say, catch me up to speed. And that can be distilled very clearly. I can get that information in whatever format I want. So my ability to context switch is actually dramatically improved, which is another thing to consider. Is that a benefit or is that a risk, right? Because if it's easier for me to actually act under a state of distraction, I might end up being more distracted. And I think it's like ultimately comes back to, what is your goal? What's your strategic like imperative? Because unless you can tie all your actions back to that, you might look back in a year, 3 years, 5 years and think, I mean, that was fun, that was interesting, but could I have gotten further? Right.
Interesting. So with context switching, one of my dear friends, Max Connect Alexander, was also at the session last week. Max has written a framework called DPH, Developer Productivity and Happiness Framework. This is his time at LinkedIn, and this is open sourced. It talks about like one of the key reasons why context switching is so critical in software development as a factor which impacts software development is because every time you context switch, uh, you have to load up back sort of like the memory, as you were saying. I feel like this is a part which is slightly changing in the way where the memory is now maintained by AI systems versus humans in their head. But I also feel like there is still the aspect of humans understanding and remembering all the corner cases and scenarios to kind of like be able to guide the AI systems. So I feel like it's still a double-edged sword in some way, where it's like context switching can be done more effectively with AI because AI can maintain, I guess, context, they use the same term, separate memory stores. But at the same time, if you're context switching constantly, there is going to be chance when, or cases where we are missing some aspects because we have switched enough that we've forgotten, some of the context associated with the task we were doing.
Totally. I completely agree with that. I think, think about this in a macro context. As an organization, it's very strategically advantageous to outsource. But if you outsource a core differentiating capability, something that is what you think makes you unique and valuable, or no, forget what you think makes you unique and valuable. What makes you unique and valuable? And I'll clarify that in a second. But if you're outsourcing those things, you're losing your entire competitive advantage, right? You're essentially handing over the keys to your long-term success to something that seems, advantageous in the short term or the long term. And why I say like what you think makes you unique and differentiated is that there's a whole ton of companies that lost about 2 decades from outsourcing technology, right? Because they didn't understand that technology was actually what held the most leverage for their differentiation and value creation. So they mistakenly said, well, this IT stuff, it's painful. We don't like doing it. It's not why we're in business. And they handed it off to some company overseas. And what they did was they held themselves in the past and watched all these companies that realized that was a strategic advantage just leapfrog. That could potentially happen if you outsource your critical thinking or the thing that like you are most uniquely poised to be an expert or authority or provide value in. And what's interesting is if you draw the company connection, you might not even know what that is, right? You might not actually know, you might be outsourcing something that is a long-term strategic advantage for you. We don't know these things, right? You have to develop a very keen sense of like, what is going to be valuable in the future? What's going to be scarce? What's going to be very unique and valuable? And the other thing that I want to talk about, sorry, I'm running. These are really like interesting questions. So I'm thinking about a lot of stuff. One more thing, some of the most valuable insights that come to human beings are like when you're in the shower, when you're washing the dishes, when you're walking the dog, when you're out wandering in a forest. And unless you have your context clean and loaded, or even like well organized in the back of your mind, but like a persistent open folder, right? Sometimes it's a messy desktop with a bunch of stuff where it's just always in the corner of your eye. That is loaded context. That can be noisy, but it can also lead you to that epiphany where out of nowhere you crack it, right? You just figure it out because it's been in your context window.
Very interesting. So, what does that mean in practical terms now, right? Like, I mean, maybe the main question here to answer is, does flow state and context switching matters the same way it mattered 2 years ago or like even a year ago? Right? Like, should organizations strive to reduce that or like reduce sort of like context switching and maintain flow state? Or is that something which is now just expected? I know intensity today has increased because of AI. What we don't know is it gonna get back and get leveled at some point, or will it kind of like perpetually stay in this state and will constantly be intense? I guess this becomes the new normal.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that back to I think the key uh, aspect of this that's really important to remember is like intentionality. Like if you're context switching because you have external demands on your time, you're constantly interrupted by fires or interruptions from stakeholders or peers or even your direct reports, that's an unsustainable situation. That is not the type of context switching that we want. We want context switching to be a an intentional activity that is part of exploring a new thread, right? Or shifting our focus because we have something that is on the right track, so we have capacity to actually focus elsewhere temporarily. That's like not often the case. But if you think about like a flow state, also like a flow state, we can be in a flow state running in the wrong direction. We can also be in a flow state doing very low value work. So if you think about the analogy of like washing the dishes, I can be in a flow state washing the dishes, thinking about whatever. I could have an incredibly valuable thought. But maybe I should just be using the dishwasher. And instead of washing the dishes, I should be wandering in nature. Because out of those two activities, one is much higher value than the other. One is delivering, differentiated value rather than like undifferentiated heavy lifting, right? This idea that if you're doing a commoditized task, manually, for instance, or you're doing something, even a commoditized task that could be outsourced to someone else because it's low value, it's already been automated, someone's already figured out how to do this for pennies on the dollar. Get rid of that stuff so that you can spend more time wandering in nature, right? Like higher value activities. So I think that we have to be very intentional about, even if we are falling into this flow state, is that flow state getting us somewhere, or are we just walking around the block 1,000 times, or just washing the dishes by hand?
Interesting. So you're saying is it's need to be more intentional, and we should still think about like where does that like what's the value we get out of that flow state. So what does that mean to like I know you were also talking about this multitasking, talking about like the new orchestrators. We also I think we're talking there's this concept that oh maybe all the junior tasks will be taken by AI. So and coding is anyways sort of we outsource now to AI. So are we just going to turn all senior engineers or every engineer into system orchestrators? Um,
Mhm.
what do you think about like the whole idea of using orchestrators to replace software development?
I think that, there's a natural evolution through history, and it's a pattern that we're seeing repeated. Might be fundamentally different now, but we're constantly building at higher and higher levels of abstraction, right? Like what was possible for us before we had, AWS APIs and Terraform, for instance. Like we spent a lot of time working on one machine, and every time something happened to that machine, it was like our whole day was gone, right? And we got really good at that. Like that took serious engineering expertise and effort and time, a lot of context. And now we've thrown that all away, right? I mean, who cares about manual configuration changes on a single machine? I don't think anybody misses it, honestly. Right. There's a lot of things that we're going to just rise up the stack with and leverage abstractions. And we're going to be, we could lament the loss of those things, but what's going to be ahead of us in terms of what's possible is really exciting. We don't even know what that is yet. We know what we're going to lose, and we're fundamentally loss aversion machines, but like we don't know how great it's going to be. That's not to say that I'm a maximalist, but I'm optimistic about there's a lot of things that we have to do. Like we have so much work. I think about the average application, the average experience that I have when I'm using any kind of technical tool, and I think it's barbaric. Like I think it's terrible today. Even the latest AI stuff, it's like I can think of a million ways it could be better in 2 minutes. And so, like, we got to get there. Like, we have so much to do that we need all these building blocks that we can build on top of to get to these higher order challenges. Because, like, I feel like we're still in the dark ages.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think it kind of like it's also AI provides us with the capabilities that we can spend more time on improving user experience and kind of like building better products. At the same time, AI has intensified the capability for anybody to build products, which means we see also a lot more worse products out there in the market. It's just like more products as well, but like, we still have if we have the right discipline, we can actually make these spend more time on improving those user experiences, right? Like thinking about all those corner cases, edge cases, which were like, okay, these are less important. Let's not do it right now, which can now be actually done with AI.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of opportunities. Eventually, I feel AI is a tool and it depends on how somebody uses it. You can use it to actually build great products, or you can use it to accelerate your roadmap and possibly like still not build products that delight users.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I mean, you can use it to run in the wrong direction, right?
Right.
Faster than ever.
All right. So I know we're close to time. So like maybe just wrapping up a little bit. I know you also mentioned somewhere with value stream mapping that it's a missing superpower, sort of like for AI success as well. How do you see sort of like value stream mapping at the intersection of AI? How can people leverage that more? What is kind of like a framework people can think about to connect the two?
Yeah, great question. So I actually think that there is a ton of variety when it comes to value stream mapping, because ultimately what matters is having a goal, like something that you want to achieve. And that could be like, we want less production defects. We want, less late nights fighting fires. But it could be more throughput. We want more delivery of value to customers. We want faster feedback from our customers. And so that, like, having a goal is very critical, and that's like absolutely essential to this process, and we often don't step away from the work to really think about that. So that's one value. The second one is like just working backwards from like, why are we in business? Why do our customers hire us? And then think about, how does that actually happen? Reveals a lot of things that you're doing that don't actually connect to that your customers don't care about, that don't add value, that you do because you started doing it a while ago and no one really remembers why we do it. There's a lot of opportunity there, stepping away. But the way that this changes with AI is that you can still have incredible value from being in a room with people, putting post notes on a wall. That I don't think will ever go away. That's really, really valuable. And again, you could throw the map away afterwards and still have a much better shared context to work from. And this clarity on like, here's what we're doing, here's the value, here's how we're going to change the system of work. But now we have more modalities possible. So we can have a conversation about a value stream now. You can, flow engineering is something that every AI knows about now. I mean, it's confusing because people have two meanings for it. There's flow engineering of context engineering, which hopefully has taken over for the original meaning. But back in, when I wrote and put together flow engineering, that's all open source stuff. So like a lot of the AIs know about it, and you can just conversationally talk to AI and say, let's walk through a flow engineering value stream exercise, and it'll guide you through, okay, what's the target outcome? Let's think about how that translates into what you're doing today and how you deliver value. So that's a new modality. You can also have an agent running in parallel while you do an in-person or a virtual mapping exercise, and build out a value stream map automatically, and then run different scenarios, right? You could say, what would happen if we tripled the team size or cut the team and divided their focus, right? So there's all kinds of interesting things that I'm seeing, that I'm testing out. I think is very, very early, but the principles haven't changed. The practices haven't changed in terms of like the value that they provide. But I do think that there's like tons of new ways to go about flow engineering.
Very cool. All right. I think that's a great way to wrap. So, Steve, is there any place people can find your work? Kind of like, I know you've also written the book. Do you want to share a little bit with the audience?
Yeah. I mean, I've got a website, visible.is. I'm on LinkedIn a lot, talking about flow and throughput and organizational design and stuff like that. those are probably the best places. If you're interested in kind of nerdy flow conversations, we have a group called the Flow Collective. You could look up, or you just send me an email about it. But very, very happy to connect with anyone from this community. I think this is a really excellent group of people, lots of smart folks, and if they're interested in getting out of friction and toil and interruptions and distractions, I'd love to have that conversation anytime.
Amazing. All right. With that, thank you so much, Steve. This was such an amazing conversation. And thank you all for listening. If you're interested in developer experience or work in platform teams, join us at HangarDX. It's dx.community. We do run virtual sessions as well as podcasts. Our virtual sessions are off the record, so you can get some very interesting inside scoops. With that, Steve, it was a pleasure having you here. I know we went a little bit over, but I think it was totally worth it.
Awesome. I hope so too. Thanks.